Thank you very much, Chris, and it's a real pleasure to take part in this this armchair event. I think it's evening here in Canberra, so I think we're crossing a big chunk of the Indo-Pacific to reach one another this morning or this evening. What I thought I'd do with this group, particularly as this is partly in lieu of, I guess, a more conventional book launch that I was hoping to do in the UK recently, but obviously interrupted by the great strategic shock of our time. What I wanted to do in the next little while is share a few thoughts with you about why I wrote this book. So I guess why I consider it important, and it may seem strange that a book about, I guess, almost the cartographic conceit of geopolitics is so important in a time when we're all feeling a very real security crisis, but why the mental map of the Indo-Pacific is important for power and strategy in the world. I will then give a quick outline of the thesis of the book without, I hope, giving away too many of the punchlines, because I do encourage you all to read it if you haven't already. I want to talk a little about why this matters for leaders, decision makers, policy makers, for the real world, if you like, beyond academia. And then I guess at the end I flag that I'm very happy to talk about anything in the discussion, including obviously what the strategic shock of COVID-19 means for the power play of the Indo-Pacific. So that's what I'll try and do in the next 10 minutes or so, and then I hope to join this discussion. So I think you've seen the book, and I naturally have a copy here with me just to remind you what we're talking about. And of course, it's actually in a way the international edition of a book that began life in Australia with a slightly different title, but it's essentially the same book. This book is, for me, a consolidation of about, I guess, 10 or even 20 years of work in the foreign policy space, looking at the region from Australia and looking at the region around Australia, why that matters for my country, but why actually the region to Australia's north and northwest and west, the maritime region of the Indo-Pacific, has become the global centre of gravity for power and wealth and strategic disruption in our time. And so it matters just as much to friends in the UK, to Europe, to North America, to the Northern Hemisphere, as it does to us in Australia. I guess, as a policy practitioner, as someone who's worked in diplomacy, intelligence, think tanks, and so on for many years, I saw and tracked this fascinating change in our region over the last 2 decades or so, where, in a sense, Australia no longer had to try to beg and plead to be a part of a certain region, let's call it Asia or the Asia Pacific, but in fact the very definition of the region that other countries were developing through their own behaviour, and I note especially the rise of China and the expansion of China's influence and interests across the seas, the rise of India as well, and others. In a sense, the region was discovering Australia as part of the strategic great game. And this opened a window on a much bigger strategic great game that was influencing world affairs. And of course, China has put its own name on that not so long ago with its so-called Belt and Road. And I argue in the book that the Chinese Maritime Silk Road is actually the Indo-Pacific with Chinese characteristics. So the book is an attempt to really set down a lot of what I've observed over the past 10 to 20 years and to give some shape to this new narrative of the way an Asia-centric region is evolving in ways that stand at odds with, firstly, the old 20th century idea of something called the Asia-Pacific that many of us were just getting used to, but also a narrative that stands at odds with the, frankly, propagandist view that comes out of the People's Republic of China that suggests Chinese centrality in world affairs, that suggests that somehow the world is returning to some historical normal of Chinese centrality. My book tells an alternate history of this region that suggests that this was always a region where China was prominent but not dominant. So the book is partly a corrective to that as well. And when we get to part 3 of my remarks, when I talk about what does this mean for decision makers, I argue that the idea of this much larger Indo-Pacific region, combining the Indian and Pacific Oceans, South and East Asia, and some non-Asian elements as well, as one strategic system, this has benefit and utility and advantage for policymakers and leaders in trying to dilute and absorb and manage Chinese power. So the thesis, if you like, the argument of the book, and you'll excuse me here because I'm going to oppress you all with a couple of maps in a moment. The argument of the book is that, in a sense, the region, the Asia-centric maritime region of which Australia is a part, is returning to a long-term historical normal of being a large, interconnected region, the Indo-Pacific, rather than little sub-regions or some artificial notion of the Asia-Pacific, that is East Asia plus North America, if you like, that was really pushed on us in the late 20th century. And that this has structural drivers. This is about, for example, China and India turning to the sea, becoming trading powers, expanding their military and other influence across the seas, but it also lends advantage for policymakers in responding, and has an interesting connection, as we'll see in a moment, to Europe, to Britain, to European history as well. So the book argues that, in fact, as we see in recent years, this term Indo-Pacific, this strange, seemingly academic term, creeping into the language of political leaders, whether it's President Trump, whether it's Prime Minister Modi, Prime Minister Abe, indeed President Macron in France has been using it, Australia, Indonesia as well, that in fact we're seeing a return to an idea that Asia is one, it's one connected region, and its connections with the global system are really providing a kind of a fulcrum or a centre of gravity in world affairs. And this takes us back, as I discovered in the research of this book, to a fascinating thread throughout history, and that is the connectivity of the maritime Asian region, where no one country was dominant. It was a multipolar region in modern terms, where, if you like, the sea was more important than the land. And that is an argument I make in the book, that in fact, particularly for the, I guess, the extraordinary efficiency and economy of seaborne trade, the sea is going to continue to outweigh the land in the international trading system. And the sea has particular value for military power as well, an advantage for island nations or maritime nations. And this was a refrain throughout much of history until this blip, this interruption of the Asia-Pacific in the late 20th century. And so, for example, and I'll quickly skim through a few of these interesting maps, if you like. So, for example, we see in this first map I'm going to share with you now from the early 15th century, from 1402, an Asia-centric view of the world, in fact, a Korean map from 1402 that captured the sweep of maritime and land-based continental Asia in one frame. India, Southeast Asia, China, Korea, Japan, even extending all the way over to Africa. And that this was a norm even before the European colonial period. And this captured, if you like, that cultural connectivity of Buddhism and Hinduism and Islam, and indeed aspects of the Chinese tributary system that knitted Asia together in one, but without a single centre. And then, if you like, as we move through the historical period, and in fact, this is where my slides are going to get the better of me in a moment, and I'm going to, here we are. As we move through history, we see that this idea of Asia as one maritime region, and Indo-Pacific, even though it was not called that at the time, was very much the character of the colonial period. And this map, which is very much very prominent in the book, I think on the inside cover, from 1570, captures a very modern flavour of what the Indo-Pacific is like. If you take a look at the modern conception of the Indo-Pacific, a map from the Australian government's Defence White Paper in 2013, South Asia, East Asia, Southeast Asia, the Indian Pacific Oceans, Australia, even parts of North America, all in one frame, connected by the sea lanes of trade and energy, and indeed military as well. It's in fact a very similar image to this one from the 16th century, from 1570. The only exception being perhaps in this map that there are mermaids and sea monsters as well, although, as I note in the book, these are no less or more mythical than, for example, the 9-dashed line that China paints around the South China Sea. And so the book makes the argument that this single frame of maritime Asia, the Indo-Pacific, was actually the norm throughout much of history. And so whether you see in this the 17th century French map or this 19th century Australian map from the journal of one of Australia's great explorers of the mid-19th century, the region was connected. East Asia, South Asia, Southeast Asia all mattered equally. It wasn't a China-centric regional order. And in fact, the little diagonal map that you can see here, the tilted map, the Australian map, captures very much the flavour of the modern Indo-Pacific, because even in the 19th century, our sea lanes of communication and security to Asia and Europe and beyond were really bringing India, China, Southeast Asia all together in the one region. This may seem a really pedantic point to make, but in fact, if you look at diplomatic history in the late 20th century, there was an obsession of building a kind of regional system in Asia that excluded South Asia, excluded India, and in some cases, certainly, if China could have its way, played the United States, North America, completely out of the picture too. And so it's interesting to see, in fact, it's quite striking to see, as the book argues, that this very Indo-Pacific way of seeing the world has been, if you like, recaptured by China in China's own way, China's own image in recent years. And so even with the tilted angle, but also the frame of reference of this extraordinary Chinese map, the new projection of the world produced by a Chinese government agency 7 years ago now, the year that the Belt and Road became Chinese policy, shows extraordinarily a vision of power and connectivity that I think informs really China's, the People's Republic of China's plans for the 21st century. That is, it's a region where particularly the maritime is dominant, the maritime Silk Road that China is now trying to dominate through power projection, through naval force, through infrastructure investment and influence building in other countries. The Indian Ocean is at the centre of this conception of China's world order. Antarctica matters too, obviously, for its long-term resources, but fascinatingly, the American continent is bisected, is cast to the edges of the known universe, almost a kind of act of strategic wish-making through maps. And so the book's thesis charts the history of the region as a unified region, as one strategic system, partly through this cartography, which again we see in China's most recent Belt and Road initiative, and the idea that even the land-based infrastructure through which China seeks to project power matters the most when it connects to the sea, through the seaports, where of course a lot of Chinese infrastructure investment and influence is wielded. And so finally, we get to this idea of a region of great connectivity, but a region of great contestation as well. And the book argues that the struggle for power and influence in Asia, and in a key part of the global system centred on Asia, is significantly in the maritime domain, in the seaports, in the sea lanes, but is not a game that, contrary to China's worldview, it's not a game that it's going to be very easy for China to win, or indeed to dominate in. And that may be a somewhat controversial point to make as we see China extend its influence through its response to the COVID crisis. But I do stand by this view that, looking at the history, the rapid rise and fall of empires past in the Indo-Pacific gives us some clues as to what lies in store for China. That is, the risks of imperial overstretch, the idea that pride comes before a fall, and that China has this unique struggle ahead of it to maintain extraordinary control domestically through its authoritarian system, while also extending control over a large number of countries externally, and tying, and I'll finish on this point, tying the, well, I'll almost finish on this point, I want to get to policy for a moment, but tying the fate of the ruling party and the authoritarian system in China to the success or otherwise of the effort to extend influence through the Belt and Road across this extraordinary regional and global system. It's a great gamble, a great risk. And if we take a long view, let's say a 20 to 25 year view of this great game, the future is far from certain and China's success is far from assured. And that brings me to my final point that I'll make before the Q&A, if I may, and that is what's in this for policy makers, decision makers and governments. So obviously all of our governments, all of our societies are properly preoccupied at the moment with getting through the long crisis that in fact emerged through those chains of connectivity that we've talked about, but emerged partly from the very authoritarian and truth suppressing nature of the Chinese political system. So in a sense, this future where China's internal fragility, internal brittleness is going to have cascading consequences around the world, but especially across this Indo-Pacific region, this future is here with us now. And the final chapter of the book, which went to print, of course, around the time or just before COVID was hitting the headlines, argues that really China needs to find a kind of a settling point where it can cope with its internal fragility as well as its external ambitions. And that's where the Indo-Pacific, the idea that China is operating across a much larger strategic space than we used to imagine or we used to deal with our various individual countries, this gives us a new kind of agency to countries that are middle players, that are not the great powers, but countries like Australia, like India, Japan, Indonesia, Vietnam, and of course, friends elsewhere in the globe as well, that it's not just a US-China contest, but that in this large strategic space, we can build new partnerships of solidarity and through our own setting of boundaries to China's power, help China find a settling point before this regional competition descends into conflict. That's the point I'll end on, and I'd be really interested at this point to hear from all of you, I guess, some questions, and hopefully to contribute to the discussion. Thank you.
Hi, Rory. Thanks for that. Absolutely fascinating talk. My understanding of Indo-Pacific has definitely gone up a few notches now. So I'm just going to jump straight into the questions and obviously open this up to the audience as well. If you've got a question, please do type it into the question box in your dashboard. But I suppose my first question to you is what is your hope with the book? I think you touched on this at the beginning. But what's your hope with the book and who have you aimed it at?
So the book is aimed at multiple audiences, and you know, I don't want this to be one of those purely scholarly books, if you like, that you know, that is read by a dozen of one's fellow academics and is duly noted in the journals and doesn't reach journalistic style to scholarship, and to aim this book at certainly at policymakers, at governments, at business, media, you know, the interested sort of intelligent general reader, if you like, to demystify a lot of this grand geopolitics of the world, but of the world that is centered now and very much on an Asian-centric maritime strategic system, the Indo-Pacific. So I guess part of the purpose of the book is that demystification. There's also the idea that the book is, I think, without being, the book's not a polemic, but I think it is meant to be a corrective to the idea that China will automatically dominate the future in precisely the way it wants us to believe. There's going to be a contest. It's not just between the US and China. And so if the book has a political or policy message, it's to provide more of a framework, more of a narrative to those countries and powers in the middle between the US and China, to give them a little bit more confidence, a little bit more agency, to suggest to them that history is not automatically against them. In fact, perhaps history and time is not on China's side. So I guess they're the hopes and objectives for the book, Chris. The timing of the release of the book is interesting because, of course, although in the final chapter I talk a lot about so-called black swans and black elephants and strategic shocks, one of those shocks has come and smacked us all much faster and much harder than we expected. But I think a lot of the message in the book about middle players and middle powers holding to their interests and their values and trying to build solidarity and resilience with one another, and using this large strategic map of the Indo-Pacific as a canvas on which to do that, I think that holds true.
Okay, thank you. So some questions have come in now, Rory. So I'm going to start with the first one. So looking ahead to the future, to what extent will China be able to overcome India's natural geographical dominance of defensive advantage west of the, and please forgive me if I mispronounce this, but is it the Strait of Malacca?
Yeah. Great. And I'm happy to take these one at a time if you like, Chris, and if you get too many, I'm happy to take them a few at a time. So I'll start on this. Yeah?
Yep.
So look, I have a slightly more, I hope a slightly more nuanced view of India than some people assume. I mean, there's an argument that the Indo-Pacific is this artificial idea that was created probably somewhere in the bowels of the Pentagon or the Indian intelligence agencies or something to empower India and put China down. And that's not, in my view, what this is about. This is about a multipolar region where China has to come to terms with the reality that there are many other powers, many other players, many other populations whose interests and sensitivities it's going to have to adjust to, just as China expects America to adjust to its interests and sensitivities. And India is part of that picture, and India is a rising power, although obviously there's big trouble in India at the moment and has been for a number of months in different kinds. If you take a long view, if you take a 25-year view, as I try to do in the book, and let's go to 2040, 2045, even with a lot of the woes and the strife that India is likely to go through, it's going to be one of the big powers this century. And in a sense, that too is a return to a natural place, because India, or Indian civilizations of various kinds, did wield power throughout much of the Indian Ocean and the wider Indo-Pacific throughout history. So the short answer is that I don't think China has a simple way of entirely neutralizing the advantages India has in India's geographic position in the world, even though India is obviously a weaker power than China. China depends and will depend for many years to come on the sea lanes of the Indian Ocean and the Indo-Pacific. In fact, if I were to say, when did the modern Indo-Pacific begin, I would say 1993, the year that China became a net importer of oil. The very year China joined an organisation called APEC and claimed to be now part of the Asia-Pacific looking east. It was actually turning south and west. And so India lies in that way permanently. India doesn't need to be an ally of countries like the US in order to be a problem for China. India just has to be India, has to keep building a degree of strength and resilience and self-confidence in its own neighbourhood. And if it does that, it's always going to complicate life for China. And China at some point is going to have to learn to treat India, I guess, as a civilizational peer if it's going to get the kind of accommodation it needs with India to protect those Chinese interests in the Indian Ocean, in South Asia, in Africa and the Middle East. China's trying to use Pakistan as part of the play against India in that regard, but I think Pakistan is going to be a pretty complicated and in some ways treacherous terrain for China to project its power through. So I'll leave it there for the moment.
Okay, I've got another question here. So are there many parallels between the way China has framed the Indo-Pacific and the way that the Imperial Japan framed the greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere?
Well, that's a provocative question. And look, the short answer is yes and no. In fact, there is another map that I don't have in this particular slideshow that I could share with you, which is a Japanese map from 1941 showing precisely the resources in different parts of the Indo-Pacific that it intended to exploit, not only for its war effort, but to, I guess, sustain its empire long term, its greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. And the little secret there, of course, is that it wasn't just a greater East Asian co-prosperity sphere. It extended into the Indian Ocean, it extended into India, it extended into, I guess, what you'd call the Indo-Pacific now. So the parallel, there is a parallel there in the geographic footprint and in the idea that, as Japan attempted to do, particularly before the war itself, that, or at least the war with nations other than China, Japan tried to project its greater East Asian prosperity sphere as a benign gift to the other peoples of Asia, binding them together through wealth and development and prosperity. There is, of course, a parallel between that and the rhetoric of the Belt and Road, which is all about win-win, a China-centric version of win-win that just happens to benefit China a lot more than others, and of course is dependent on other countries, if you like, accepting China's influence and worldview. Where the Japanese and Chinese ambitions obviously separate is in the military dimension. And I don't claim in the book that China is hell-bent on some kind of military domination of the region. China does not want to risk war particularly. Mind you, you can make a case that that Japan would have preferred to have not gone into the full Pacific War or Indo-Pacific War either, but its decision-making was disastrous, of course. But I think China is a lot more risk-averse on the military front than in the end Imperial Japan proved to be. And that's where we have an opportunity, those other countries, the middle powers in the region, to, if you like, talk some sense to Chinese policymakers, because there are still some in the Chinese system who remember what China was like 10 or 12 or 15 years ago, when it was much less assertive in the region. And frankly, if China returned to that kind of posture, I think we would find a little bit of the coexistence that the book calls for.
Great. So I've got a question. What will the Indo-Pacific look like as a political unit after coronavirus, in terms of an entity?
Yeah, look, so that's that's the $1 trillion question, and I think no one who gives you an answer to that knows actually what the answer is. Look, the the book warns about strategic shocks, and in fact, in the very preface of the book, which I wrote in January, sitting here in Canberra amidst the smoke of bushfires, another strategic shock we were having at the time, climate induced, I made the point that any prediction about the way this central region of the world is going to unfold in this uncertain decade ahead is essentially giving a gift to fate. We just don't know. The general answers I can give you, though, are that even if China continues as it is at the moment to project the impression, false or accurate or whatever, that it is coping better with the very pandemic that, if you like, originated in China and originated in China's own mismanagement internally, nonetheless, there will remain a multipolar character to the region. Now, it's going to get harder, certainly in the short term and even perhaps the medium term, for countries like India and Indonesia, who I think will be very hard hit by coronavirus, to project power and influence externally. But we have to remember that they have very young populations, and that their chances of bouncing back over I guess a 10 to 20 year time frame are still very, very good, despite obviously the human suffering that we're going to see in the near term. There is the question of whether coronavirus will damage the democratic institutions within countries like India and Indonesia, because already both those countries have been on pathways that suggest a little bit of fragility to their democracy, and that's a disturbing thing. But at a strategic level, I think the multipolarity will remain. The question, I think many countries, and Australia is one of them, will look again at how over-reliant they've become on, I guess, aspects of connectivity to the global system, particularly in supply chains, how over-reliant they've become on China as a single market. And so there'll be, I think, renewed efforts at diversification and renewed efforts at some degree, some limited degree of self-reliance as well. But I still think it's unlikely that we'll see the entire, I guess, connectivity and trading system in the region break down. The navies in the region are still all over the place, if you like. The energy dependence hasn't fundamentally changed. But we do have to remain pretty agile on this and willing to change our minds when the facts change. I mean, I've spent a lot of my career in the last sort of 10 to 20 years trying to persuade policymakers in this country and elsewhere that the old Asia-Pacific template was no longer fit for purpose for our policy making, that we needed a new mental map that included the Indian Ocean and India. I think we have to remain agile to the possibility that over time the mental map will change again.
A few more questions. Just bear with me 1 second. Okay. From the perspective of the small Pacific Islands, the Pacific Islands Forum, there is a risk of becoming strategically less relevant or lost within the concept of the Indo-Pacific versus the Asia-Pacific. Where do you see their place in the years to come?
Look, that's a great question. I wish I knew who were asking these questions, but it doesn't matter. Look, that's an excellent question. I don't agree with its kind of assumption, though, or with its, I guess, its presumption that this will make the South Pacific or the Pacific Islands and their own institutions less relevant. I think in a strange, paradoxical way, it could actually make them more relevant. And I'll say why. I mean, so, you know, the Asia-Pacific, just like the Indo-Pacific, is a mental map that certain governments have promoted for their own purposes. And I argue that the Indo-Pacific has a greater organic kind of historical reality to it than the Asia-Pacific, because the Asia-Pacific was particularly about knitting together East Asia, the Pacific and North America in the second half of the 20th century, whereas I argue that the Indo-Pacific is about bonds of connectivity that go back thousands of years, including to the Pacific Islands. If you look at the history or the proto-history of maritime peoples between Southeast Asia, the Indian Ocean and the Pacific Islands, there were links there before, I guess, modern recorded history. The Pacific Island countries, the small countries that are focused rightly on the well-being of their people, the need for development, their need to be stewards of their maritime natural resources, and these countries rightly want to keep their heads down and keep away from great power strategic competition, which the Indo-Pacific is partly about. However, they don't really have a choice. In a sense, great power competition in the region has discovered them whether they like it or not. And much of that in the last 5 to 10 years comes from the rapid acceleration of China's strategic and geoeconomic and influence footprint precisely in those countries and their maritime zones. So the Indo-Pacific may be good for them in a sense because it gives them, if you like, a larger space and an absolutely maritime space in which to present and prosecute their interests. It actually gives them, interestingly, common cause with the small island states of the Indian Ocean, who are facing exactly the same problems and have faced the same problems first. In fact, you know, China's use of so-called debt diplomacy, incidentally or systematically, we can argue the point, but China's influence in Maldives, in Sri Lanka, Seychelles, a lot of the Indian Ocean predated its influence in the South Pacific. And the lessons that we're learning from how, for example, democracy in the Maldives has coped quite well with protecting its interests in this new great game may hold some benefits for the small countries of the South Pacific. So I argue that if they're clever about it, the Pacific Island states can prosecute their interests just as well, perhaps even more effectively in the Indo-Pacific than in an Asia-Pacific that never particularly respected them.
Thanks, Rory. Just to say, obviously, I'm not releasing, obviously, I've got the names of the people, but they're not.
I know, I'm just curious.
just a final question, really. So, actually, I've got two final ones. I mean, how do you feel towards China in this, in terms of the role of the Indo-Pacific? Are they seen as a progressive force, a threat? In what sense? How do we perceive China in relation to Indo-Pacific?
Sorry, what do you mean exactly? I mean, who's we?
Sorry, how do you, then perceive? Sorry.
Oh, so look, if I had more time, I mean, I'd talk a little bit more about my own China journey, if you like, because I'm someone who in some ways is a lapsed China engager. I spent a lot of time in the first decade of this century dealing with Chinese think tanks, Chinese academics, Chinese government officials on a lot of these issues of the strategic balance in the region and China's interests, its analysis and its behaviour. And I guess, like a lot of China watchers, I'm frustrated and disappointed at the turn that China's policy has taken in the past 8 to 10 years, because I think China was on a path until around, let's say, just the aftermath of the global financial crisis 10 or 11 years ago. China was on a path to be a prominent, but not necessarily dominant player in a region where coexistence and cooperation were becoming the name of the game on many issues. And I think, unfortunately, and of course China is not the only power to blame in this story, but unfortunately Chinese decision makers have taken, at the very time that China's interests expanded across the seas and into the Indo-Pacific, which was in some ways a natural progression of the sheer size and scale of the Chinese economy. But at the same time as that, we've seen a hardening of authoritarianism internally in China. We've seen this concentration of power, and we've seen this really fixation on assertiveness and influence and even coercion by China on the world stage. And my argument is that this is not healthy for China or any other country in the long term. So we have to come to terms with China in the Indo-Pacific. There would be no Indo-Pacific without China. It's the quintessential Indo-Pacific power. If you look at the Belt and Road, the rapid expansion of China's influence and interests, the return of the Chinese Navy to the Indian Ocean that the book describes in great detail in 2008, which was an absolute turning point. Late 2008, early 2009, China's Navy came back to the Indian Ocean for the first time in 600 years, and this time it's here to stay. So all of these are realities that other countries have to deal with. China is not, if you like, the root of all instability in the region, but it is playing, in my view, a generally unhelpful and outsized destabilising role. Of course, the United States under the Trump administration is doing itself and regional stability quite a lot of harm as well. But my argument is that China still has an opportunity to push much more in the direction of mutual respect and coexistence, so that it can perhaps learn the lessons of empires past in the Indo-Pacific without having the hard landing that most of those empires had.
Okay, thanks, Rory. So the final question is so the final question is probably a bit more trivial and throws it off its axis a bit, but in terms of summary, if you were to attend an armchair event, which author in history would you want to watch, and what book would that be?
Oh wow, that really has completely thrown me. I mean, I've got a very long list, but I'm often just, and look, I will go a little bit off piste here, because I'm just as interested in fiction, if you like, as history, and I think that strategic thinkers and strategic analysts need to pay a lot more attention to fiction if they want to understand how decisions are made in crisis and how really the human factor can change the course of history. So I'm struggling to come up with a single author for you here, but I'd be just as interested in probably some of the great fiction writers of the 20th century, someone like Graham Greene, for example, as I would be in necessarily historians or political scientists.